Hello everyone. You read the title of the video, so let's get right into it. X mode allows for higher mobility, better dodge moves and more reach with your weapon while filling the switch gauge with successful attacks. Sword mode has very powerful attacks, but is less mobile and has worse evasive options. It also consumes switch gauge, so you can't use it infinitely like X mode, but more on that later. Switch X is a weapon with a lot of aspects, so you can jump around the video to find what you need right now, but I structured it to start with X mode, going into X to sword morphing, talking about the weapon info, which is mainly important for sword mode, moving on to sword mode itself, and then we get to the best chains, skills, game plan and so on. Let's begin with the draw attacks. You have 4 different draw attacks with Switch X. An X draw attack or a sword draw attack. Those two lead into various different options, including the second hit of your standard chains. I also want to mention the Sacred Dismount attack, which consists of 2 hits and is mostly useful for mounting the monster. It doesn't deal great damage and has no special properties except for mounting. But it does lead directly into your Spiral Burst Slash, a very important move because it fills a lot of switch gauge. More on that move later, you will hear a lot about it. And I suppose your Sneak attack also counts as a draw attack, and in Switch X's case it is the so-called Heavy Slam. Also a very important move I'll mention more later, and usually the best way to start a hunt. And by the way, a sneak attack is not possible on flying monsters. Now onto our openers. In X mode you have 2 different openers once your weapon is drawn. The quick forward slash, which is good for closing a small gap, and the forward overhead slash, which covers a great distance and deals pretty decent damage. Both openers lead into the second hit of your standard chain, just like the draw attacks. You can chain these two together, but only if you do the forward slash first. Very situational, but still neat if a monster is crawling away from you or you miscalculated how large the gap to the monster is. The forward overhead slash can be done basically any time you are in X mode and is a great tool to keep up with the monster. Together with focus mode you can run around the monster and position yourself better to hit weaker parts. Let's talk about X mode basics now. Here is our first X mode chain. Your openers lead into the second hit in this chain, and especially the last one, the Spiral Burst Slash, is a crucial move because you need to hit X attacks to build switch gauge, which powers your sword mode, and the Spiral Burst builds the most out of all basic X attacks. You can see the motion values and the gauge generation on the side nodes next to the displayed chain. Your motion values are basically the percentage of your weapon's maximum damage. For beginners, the higher this number is, the more damage this attack will deal. You can see the motion values on the Math Hunter's web app, which is linked in the pinned comment below. Your special chain is the Wild Swing, an infinite attack that consumes your stamina. While not dealing any meaningful damage at all, it has its uses. After at least 2 Wild Swings, you can perform the Heavy Slam, powering up your X. More on Power X mode in the weapon info section of the video, but you do want to keep it active as much as possible because it raises your attack for X mode and lets you generate more switch gauge with each attack. There are 4 ways to activate Power X mode, all coming from variations of this Heavy Slam. One other way is the Sneak attack, which I already mentioned. The other 2 ways are follow-ups to your Offset attack and Focus Strike, which I will explain in a second. Also on the special attack button is the Fate Slash. You can do this one after any X attack except for Wild Swing, and while you can't do it from neutral, you can do it out of focus mode. This move can help you to reposition, hit a flying monster or a part that is high above you. You can chain it together with other overhead slashes to attack flying monsters, for example. Exclusive to X mode is your Offset attack. It can be accessed from neutral or after any X attack except for Wild Swing. Hitting it can be tricky since you cannot hold it like other weapons and you have a wind up for it, which can throw off your timing in the beginning. I'd only recommend using it on monsters or moves you are familiar with. You can follow up with either the aforementioned Heavy Slam or a hefty sword mode strike. I already have a special episode on the Offset attack in my Switch X Academy playlist, which is linked in the pinned comment below. Monsters have an offset threshold, meaning the first offset always sends the monster flying, but the next couple of attacks will not grant you the special follow-ups, so it works like a status effect. It is possible to trigger multiple times, you simply need more and more successful offsets until you get another knockdown. I'm gonna call the offset attacks that don't send the monster flying the threshold offsets from now on. You can still perform Heavy Slam after a threshold offset to activate or refresh Power X mode and build some switch gauge if the attack connects, or you can follow up with the Spiral Burst Slash to build up a big chunk of switch gauge if the monster is in reach. Oh, and beware of the chip damage on threshold offsets. Lastly, we have the Focus Strike. You strike from the top right to your lower left, and connecting to a wound will result in 4 quick swings of the axe, ending in a Heavy Slam, or you can morph mid-Focus Strike into Sword mode for a quick discharge. It is also a nice way to build up switch gauge. Remember that wounds do not close on their own except with Guardian monsters, so you can destroy them when you need to. When the monster tries to leave, for example, or keep a wound active on a monster that likes to fly and destroy it while it is airborne, so you can bring it down. Before we come to the weapon info and sword mode, we have to talk about morphing. You can morph between both modes at any time after any attack, or even from neutral. This is one of the most important things to keep in mind when playing Switch X. You can also chain morph attacks into each other, although that isn't particularly optimal or useful if I'm being honest. You do have different morphing attacks though, depending on when you decide to switch modes. Let's have a look at the morph moves from X to sword mode first. Most of your attacks will simply be a swift overhead slash into sword mode. While you can morph attack from neutral, you can combine it with a dodge roll to cover more ground. This can help you to get out of AoE attacks, especially in the less mobile sword mode. After a Heavy Slam, the Spiral Burst Slash or a Threshold Offset attack, however, you will perform the Double Rising Slash. And while in Wild Swing, you will perform the Morph Sweep, a very long and committing attack, dealing decent damage and having great reach. Now let's talk about the weapon info. There are 3 key elements here. The switch gauge fills up when you land attacks in X mode or when your weapon is sheathed, and as long as you are above this threshold of 30%, you can enter sword mode. Sword mode consumes this switch gauge with each attack. The amount you consume is dependent on the attack. Power X mode, which is activated by any of the aforementioned Heavy Slams, gives you a damage boost to all X attacks of 10 raw and increases the amount of switch gauge you get for successful attacks. Power X mode lasts for 45 seconds, but another Heavy Slam will reset the timer and it can be prolonged to 90 seconds with Power Prolonger. And finally we have the amp meter. As you attack in sword mode, hitting the monster will build amp meter. Once the amp meter is full, you enter amped state. Amped state adds additional Phial bursts onto your sword attacks and gives you access to 2 special finishers I'll talk about in the finisher section of the video. It lasts for 45 seconds just like Power X mode and can be doubled to 90 seconds with Power Prolonger, but unlike Power X mode, amped state cannot be refreshed before it runs out. Entering amped state also gives you a big chunk of switch gauge back, so don't be afraid to run low on gauge if you're close to getting amped up. Filling the amp meter depends on your file type. The file system also got its own episode, so for now just keep this in mind. Power files take the most sword attacks to amp up and boost raw damage. Element files boost elemental damage and are a bit easier to amp up. Dragon and status files are the easiest to reach amped state with and obviously deal their respective damage type as well. When you try to morph into sword mode while being below the morphing threshold, you will reload the weapon manually instead. We want to avoid this mid-combat, but it can happen every now and then. However, if there is a ledge nearby or when jumping from your secret, you can perform a jumping reload, which is much quicker and can actually be a viable technique. If you are in sword mode, you can still attack while being below the threshold, but if you empty it completely, you are forced into a standing morph animation. Also something to avoid mid-combat. You can save yourself, however, with a morph attack back to X mode to avoid the standing morph animation. Alright, now let's finally get to sword attacks. Just like X mode, you have a standard triple chain, dealing the highest sustained DPS when in amped state, but it only builds a bit of amp meter. But that's not all. You can move in every direction with each strike. This makes these attacks very useful for positioning. Together with aiming in focus mode, you couldn't ask for more freedom of movement while also staying engaged to your target. Your special chain consists of the double slash into Heavenward Flurry. This is the best chain to build up amp meter. This is also the only combo you cannot simply repeat. After Heavenward Flurry you have to do a Rising Slash to get back into double sideway, which, by the way, turns into a triple slash after the left Rising Slash or double Morph Slash from X mode. So basically when your sword is held over your left shoulder. You can mix these two chains together, but Heavenward Flurry is only accessible after a double or triple sideways slash or a successful counter, and builds the most amp meter, so you do want to do it while building up amp state. It isn't particularly useful for DPS though. While X mode has the offset slash, sword mode has access to a counter. You can do this counter anytime you want in sword mode, even from neutral, and it activates instantly. While the counter window is pretty big, there is a perfect counter window where the chip damage is massively reduced, you gain amp meter and you get all the switch gauge back that this move consumed. A successful counter also leads straight into Heavenward Flurry. Very amazing tool to stay aggressive and build amp meter. And yes, you can counter roars or even flashes from Gypsyros, or even Gorgmasios nuke. Since Title Update 4 you can also sidestep out of the counter right after triggering it, so you can chain them together incredibly fast, or chain them into a morph attack or whatever your current situation requires. You also have access to your focus strike in sword mode, and it works pretty much the same as in X mode. You can always switch between both modes even within the focus strike itself and choose which finisher you want to do. It basically is a question of, do I want to deal damage or do I need to build switch gauge? Same for the finishers. Do you want to get more of Power X mode and build gauge, or do you want to get some nice damage in and potentially follow up with another strong finisher? Speaking of finishers, now let's get to the truly big hitters. The classic is the Elemental Discharge. Entering it and spamming the attack button will build up to a massive explosion. This consumes a lot of switch gauge, but it builds a good bit of amp meter and deals pretty good damage. You can discharge early by moving backwards while spamming the attack prompt. The discharge will be weaker though. Or if you stop spamming the attack button, you will simply stop the charging process. If you are in amped state, you can do the zero-sum discharge by holding the initial attack prompt. It is the same attack, but you latch onto the body part you first hit. You can also release early by stopping to mash the attack button, leading to a less powerful explosion, but you just drop back to the ground and don't have to sit through the very cool but long recovery animation, which leaves you wide open for attacks from the monster. You also have hyper armor during the ZSD, so even roars won't affect you. And since Title Update 4, you can evade out of the recovery animation earlier, so you can get back to the monster again pretty quickly. The zero-sum discharge deals more damage than the elemental discharge as well. Next to the elemental and zero-sum discharge, we have the unbridled slash and full release slash. You can perform the unbridled slash from neutral and pretty much after most sword attacks, or you can chain into it right after a discharge. Not the ZSD, but the regular one. This also counts for the quick discharge from the focus strike finishers. You need a pretty big opening though to pull all of this off, so be sure you have the time if you want to go for it. If you are in amp state, you gain access to the full release slash. Here you hold the morph button after initiating the unbridled slash to charge up to the FRS, so you can choose which attack to do depending on your situation. A very powerful finisher with a long charge up but hyper armor and very good reach. Also, since Title Update 4, you can evade out of the charging process for both FRS and US. Full release slash isn't the best option anymore for DPS after TU4, but it still is the biggest burst of damage and absolutely still has a lot of use cases. All finishers will leave you in X mode, giving them the finisher characteristic. The unbridled slash and FRS have a very long recovery animation you can either cancel out of with a dodge, or it leads straight into your spiral burst slash, regaining a big chunk of switch gauge. Okay, we talked about X to sword morphing, now onto sword to X morphing, which again is always possible. After most attacks you do a pretty standard morph slash back to X mode. After rising slashes and the counter slash however, you perform a double morph slash. And as I mentioned before, your finishers also leave you in X mode, but they aren't considered morph attacks. You can also access your heavy axe opener from the beginning of the video. This can help you if the monster is far away and you need to close the gap, but also want to get to X mode. Alternatively, you can dodge roll morph, but you can only do a sidestep before you can do a roll in sword mode while attacking, so this particular morph attack can save time and catch up to the monster. Another very quick morph attack to reposition and get back to X mode is the morph Fate Slash. It is quick, repositions you backwards and leaves you in X mode. All sword to X morphing slashes except the forward overhead slash will let you instantly go for the spiral burst slash. A key component in gauge management, which also has its own section in this video. Believe it or not, but Switch X has a variety of aerial attacks as well. From a jump you can either perform an axe or sword attack, use the morph button to access the opposite mode while jumping. You can do the jumping reload as I already mentioned if you are below the morphing threshold, and while sliding you can either perform an axe sweep or a sword mode rising slash, and from here you can go for a downward sword slash or morph for an axe attack on your way down. Or you go for a discharge, even letting you attach to the monster for a ZSD. The discharge is also available from X mode after a jump, so this is the only way of accessing your discharge directly from X mode. Okay, so that is the entire moveset explained, now let's put it to good use. A good way to start your hunt is by performing the sneak attack on the monster to get right into Power X mode. Then you close the gap to the monster and go into sword mode. You counter the raw, leading into Heavenward Flurry, which may leave you amped up already by the time the monster has really aggroed on you. This opening depends slightly on the monster and whether it has a raw that stuns you or not, but the general plan is sneak attack, morph to sword mode and build as much amp meter as possible while countering the first raw. Now onto the stuff you're really here for. The standard sword chain is your bread and butter DPS chain for power files. The triple slash chain can out-damage it on element-focused builds on the right matchups. As already mentioned, your Heavenward Flurry chain is the quickest way to end state, which should always be your main priority. The long morph loop consists of the standard sword chain into double morph slash and back to sword mode. It can be very viable and a self-sustaining loop with rapid morph, Power X mode and end state, but it isn't optimal, so we're not allowed to use it. Full release slash isn't the best loop anymore for sustained DPS, but as I mentioned it still has many use cases because of its hyper armor and extremely high burst of damage. You can tank through an attack or raw with it if timed correctly. You can use it when running out of switch gauge or end state to get a last burst of damage into the monster or as a follow-up to your focus strike morph finisher. The zero sum discharge is only actually useful on very fast monsters like Lalabarina, Seregios and maybe even Rathalos or Raidao, so basically fast monsters and those that like to move around a whole lot. Even if it isn't optimal, it is good to focus damage on a specific part and lets you use damage no other melee weapon could use. And just like anything Switch X does, it looks and feels super satisfying and is pure aura farming. Building switch gauge is the key to creating a flow, so let's see how you can keep it going. Every single morph attack from sword to axe builds a small amount of gauge. Actually hitting that morph attack builds additional switch gauge. You also have direct access to the spiral burst slash, which is by far the easiest and most accessible way to build a big amount of switch gauge. The only exception to this is the morph forward overhead slash, because while it is a morph slash, the moveset treats it like an opener, so it leads into the sideways slash and then spiral burst. And as I mentioned before, the full release slash and your dismount attack also lead directly into it. The offset slash and its follow-up heavy slam also give you a huge boost. And with a huge boost I mean almost 100% of your gauge. But in general, you really want to focus on the spiral burst slash and the shortcuts to it, because the offset follow-up morph slash deals an insane amount of damage. You are always sacrificing DPS for switch gauge, which is okay, but you have to decide when and how to do so. The most efficient way is to get the spiral burst slash. Also keep that Power X mode active for the boost in switch gauge gain. If you miss your spiral burst slash, you can try to close the gap to the monster, so you only have to do the sideways slash again to get another chance to connect spiral burst. Switch X is a highly mobile weapon despite its size. While sword mode is less mobile than X mode, you can switch so quickly between both that it really isn't much of an issue, and if there's an attack coming you can't evade, you still have your counter in sword mode to keep the upper hand. Next to the dodge rolls in X mode, you have so many attacks that help you to reposition while staying aggressive. Getting to know all of these will let you have an answer to any situation. This section will probably also get a separate Switch X Academy episode to really focus on all the options I talked about in the video and how to put them to good use, but to give you a quick recap of your insane mobility, you have the forward overhead slash and its morph version, backwards fade slash and its morph version, dodge roll attacks leading into morph slashes, which can be adjusted in direction, your standard sword chain lets you take a step with each hit, many moves like heavenward flurry can be turned 180 degrees with focus mode, and focus mode in general really boosts Switch X's mobility to another level. You can chain many of these moves together, downward fade slash into X fade slash into a dodge roll backwards, forward overhead slash into morph slash, back into overhead morph slash. Your X fade slash can drift you around a corner thanks to focus mode. Same for the forward overhead slash. So much freedom and possibilities, and I just want to encourage you to try for yourself and really practice utilizing focus mode for your mobility. Let's talk about Switch X specific skills now. Rapid Morph. While it was a skill tax in Rise and Sunbreak, it is now more of a comfort skill. I honestly really love it because of the quicker transition between modes, so you can more quickly set up an offset attack, or if you really want to focus on morph loops for your damage. You can basically always equip another skill which will yield more damage overall throughout your hunt, so as of now it is more comfy skill than important for DPS. But it offers great utility and saved me lots of times by letting me switch modes fast enough to counter incoming attacks accordingly. Power Prolonger. Very nice skill, boosting your amped state in Power X mode to 90 seconds from 45 seconds. On power files it is basically mandatory because power files take the most effort to enter amped state. On element files or all others you really don't need it and instead might want to use either Rapid Morph or, as I said, something like attack boost, crit boost if you haven't maxed it already, or even elemental damage. Focus will boost your switch gauge and amp meter fill rate. It isn't a huge boost and may be interesting for beginner players, but you should honestly drop it entirely. You can try it of course, but there are simply way better skills to equip. Counter-Strike is an absolute must-have and pretty much mandatory. It activates on hyper armor, counters and offsets, so it has great uptime and is a very nice damage boost for only a few slots in your armor. Doshaguma's Might is amazing and since Title Update 4, pretty easy to slot in with a decent Gogma roll. The plus 10 raw for 3 minutes are really good, and if you roll it on a Gogma weapon you can make an amazing set with it if you at least somewhat regularly use the offset slash. Coming from Iceborne, evade window was mandatory back then, but in Wilds, while not mandatory, it is nice to have to become absolutely untouchable, if you know what you're doing, or if you know what the monster is doing. But you can get a level 3 evade window from the Zeus meal or when using a turbid shrimp, which I always use, so at max I use evade window level 2 to max it out. Other than that you may want a sharpness enhancing skill, because Switch X doesn't care and requires a lot of maintenance. Protective polish, speed sharpening, master's touch if you have high affinity, which you absolutely should have. Speaking of affinity, remember that these are Switch X specific skills I talked about. You of course also want to get your typical latent power, critical boost and max might in here, depending on what your current sets allow for and what you are aiming for. Switch X is also a powerful elemental weapon, so skills increasing element damage will be interesting as well. If you have any questions regarding anything about Switch X, be sure to let me know. Also drop your own tips if I missed something or you think I didn't stress enough. And there you have it, a complete guide to the Switch X for Monster Hunter Wilds. I really hope you enjoyed it and learned something new, and I'd love to hear your feedback as well as constructive criticism. If you're looking for more details, be sure to check out my Switch X Academy playlist. For detailed insights into the math of SwitchX, I can highly recommend Fox Invictus or Sash, who is the supervisor of the SwitchX section of the Math Hunters web application, which is by far the best way to plan your builds and test them in theory and even quickly compare them. I also have an entire video about it, all of which can be found in the pinned comment below. Drop your questions in the comments and I hope to see you on future videos and streams. Happy hunting everyone!